So why don't we just quickly do an introduction to begin with. My name is Chi Xiao. I am the design manager at FileMaker. This is my ninth DEF CON, and I've been speaking a few times in the past. So how many of you have not been in my session before? Oh, a lot. Okay, good. So for those of you who have participated in my sessions, you probably know that I like to use everyday objects and I like to use metaphors to talk about how we approach design. So this year would be the same, except that the presentation will be broken down into half. The first 30 minutes will be presented by me, and I will be talking about storytelling in design. And the second half of the presentation will be presented by a talented member of mine, Esther Kim. She has a background of fine art and also the experience in motion graphic and special effects in the advertising world. This is her first time speaking at DEF CON, and she will be using concrete examples, elaborating the way that she thinks about design, and also she will cover and elaborate the fundamental elements of visual communications. And I hope this 30 minutes combination is going to be a fun, refreshing experience for you, because I tend to talk about something a little bit more abstract, and she will be talking something a little bit more practical. And we will be, for both presentations, we will be giving you some examples, and these examples can be downloaded later after this session, along with some documents and also the FileMaker Pro template file that you can use for your next project. So before I prepare my slides, I knew that there are two topics I would like to cover today. One is visual communication. Two is storytelling. And just not long ago, and I had the opportunity to watch a TV show on Netflix, and I saw that, hey, this TV show is great, and I would like to put it in my presentation, so I added another section. So that being said, my 30 minutes presentation will be divided into three parts, and let's just get started. How many of you have not heard about Maria Kondo? Just a few. Okay, so she's a phenomenon. So it's interesting that when I talk to my designer friends that I'm going to talk about Maria Kondo, and they're laughing. They say, "Of course you want to talk about Maria Kondo. She's a cliche." Well, for those of you who don't really know who Maria Kondo is, she is the host of a reality TV shows on Netflix, author of a popular book called The Life-Changing Magic of Tidying Up. And she is a recent cultural phenomenon talking about finding happiness and finding the things that spark joy, as she call it, through organizing and appreciating your house goods. I find this TV show really interesting, so I do want to talk about Maria Kondo, and hopefully not in a too cliche way. So the specific message she talked about in terms of organizing household goods, the things that I find in particular intriguing is that she used this method called KonMari method. And KonMari method, at heart, as she stated in the TV show, is that it's really not about throwing things away, but it's really about keeping things what you want. Keep the things that you want. So there is a distinctive difference between these two, and the way that she approached the problem is that through this careful touching, folding your clothes, and decluttering your closet, and putting labels in your object, you find appreciation and trust with your belongings. And then through that entire process, you discover something that really matters, something that she calls spark joys. I find this particular notion pretty interesting, and I thought that, hey, well, this has a lot to do with design. So I'll repeat that method again. You find appreciation and trust through touching, folding, and decluttering of your household goods. And I think that that's exactly what goes through my mind when I'm working on design. So as a software application designer, your medium is very much visual. And how you organize information has a lot to do with how your user perceive how easy your application to use. And I call this an unspoken sense of comfort. Unspoken sense of comfort equals to ease of use. So we like to say that, oh, I find that application is very, I like it, I don't like it, but you can't necessarily be able to pinpoint what exactly you like, what exactly you don't like, because there is a perceptions of this, whether it's difficult to use, simple to use. I think that's all connected to this notion of, I call it, unspoken sense of comfort. So the way I think about this term, aside of things being pretty, is that as a designer, you should always be thinking about what your user had in mind and what is your user's next steps could be. And be always aware of potential mental blockers that could potentially stop or slow down your user's progress. And in other words, keep the things that really matters. So in a sense, this is really a communication process. And the one that does this the best, in my view, is Apple. So I'm using this particular example to demonstrate how Apple designers think. And I think this is actually one of the greatest examples to show what we think conversational design is about. So in this particular chart, well, it's very simple. There's not a lot of information. But if you pay attention to this screenshots, then you'll find that there are 3 pieces of information. Which one is right to you? Image. And to the bottom left corner, you see buy and learn more. And in the middle, you have something about batteries, and then it says iPhone. I think this visual workflow is simple, brilliant, because it tells you, it starts with a very simple, catchy phrase of which one is right for you. And the next action you're supposed to do is buy now or learn more. You can find this kind of example everywhere on apple.com. From visual images, from the sentences that you see, from the user interface and UI elements that you see, they are all combined to be in a simple, very linear, concentrated form that lead your users to a very specific end result. And I think that is something worth to highlight. And I will talk about how we handle large amount of information a little bit later, because we know that Apple usually, when you see their design, is usually you find something that is very simple, and they take pride of that simplicity. So let me give you a few counter examples. So if you are not disciplined enough to make these conversations to be in a consistent tone, then you can easily make mistake like this. It generates confusion. In this case, red color, what does it mean? Does it mean most expensive? Is it most common? And what's the relationship between this red and the red of handles? And I personally feel like, I always like to joke about this, I think this particular color coding should be regulated. Because I think this causes harm. The arrangement of information is very important. And I know that this seems very obvious to you, but if you look at all your applications, including the application that we design, you always find that, well, you probably, the arrangement of your boxes doesn't necessarily form a conversational flow. And this is very, how to say it? I like to highlight this example because I use these machines a lot, and I always find these machines confusing, including the ATM machines that I use. I'm not exactly sure which one I should go. Is it 1, 2, 3, and then the feedback is not very consistent, and my eye has to go here and there. So I think this is also a common mistake that you thought is obvious, but I think you should be constantly aware when you're doing design. And certainly you don't want things to be cluttered. This is a pretty famous meme a couple years ago. For those of you from Japan, you probably know what I'm talking about. Towards the left, this is a coffee machine made by a famous Japanese design firm. The problem about this coffee machine is that the designers use this letter R and L representing regular and large. But for Japanese customers, they're not really accustomed to this concept of regular or large, and this R and L, it creates a very odd confusion about, is it hot, cold? Is it, what exactly, is it size or not size? And there is a upper and bottom section. It just caused a lot of confusions. So the owner of the 7-Eleven store, they start putting tags. And the more tags that they're explaining, the worse it gets. So when I tackle visual design problems, I have a tendency to look at a few areas. One, it is very important to clarify what exactly this page is about, just at a glance. Just look at it, you should be able to communicate to your user what they're supposed to do. So the way I try to do this is that it can be done through proper labeling, large text, or large image, or basically just put things on the top. So it basically gives your users a general framework, so that when they enter this location, whether it's a page, or it's a module, or it's a current focus, they will know they will have some kind of associations to understand what's going on here on the page. Call to actions are usually limited to very few items. In this case, I only have 2 buttons, one to the left and one to the right. I know that when we're adding buttons, there are so many actions that you want your users to do, but keep in mind that if this button is not contextual or not relevant to your current workflow, it should be hidden, dismissed, or de-emphasized. So call to action is I will cover call to actions a little bit more later in my slides, but generally speaking, I try to keep it minimum. When taking users' input, put your fields element in groups. Divide them by functions, size, with clear labels. So I often get these questions that, well, I have a lot more information to fill than this box. What should I do? And the natural instinct is that, well, let's make everything smaller so that I can have more space to fill things in, right? Wrong. What you should do is you should really concentrate on a particular use case. And if there is a use case that is, whether it's contextual or maybe it can be irrelevant to your current focus, I would recommend you to take this workflow somewhere else. So easy to look at, well-organized layout, clear actions and proper divisions by function. In my view, this fits very well with the decluttering methods of what Maria Kondo says in her show. And as users make progresses, there's always this learning curve when they are exposed to new interface. So organizing information properly and keep things that matters, allow the discovery of possibilities, and allows users to make progresses a little faster. So the opposite is that, well, you get this negative line. So if the order of information or your structures of information does not necessarily meet what users had in mind, over time, the satisfaction decreases. And this is where I called it contribute to this perception of how easy your application to use. And obviously, the more positive points that you get, the better. And the more negative points that you get, and eventually you get this perception that I really think this application is bad application. So that being said, I think the art of organizing is really not a cliche. I think Maria Kondo's method makes sense. And the show is a lot of fun to watch. I recommend that. So next, I want to talk about storytelling and everyday experience. How do we navigate information space? Naturally, we organize information by groups, by categories. And by putting things into groups and continue repeating those groups, you form some kind of conventional way to organize things into categories. And once you're familiar with the conventional way of categorizing, then you naturally just go to the sections that you're familiar with. Over time, you build a habit, and you just quickly go to that particular aisle or particular section without a lot of thinking. However, information is not always being broken down into convention categories. So there are other factors that influence what to see and then influence the decisions of what you want to buy. So here are the two bookstore examples that I would like to call out. And in these two scenarios, instead of looking for a specific book I want, what I do is maybe just like many of you when you walk into the bookstores or supermarket or library, just look around. By looking around, I think this chart is interesting. These two experiences, the left and the right, are very different. And I find that when I go to the bookstore or the supermarket, my mind kind of hops between these two mental states. Sometimes I want a cozy, slow browsing experience. Sometimes I want recommendations, and my eye would just naturally shuffle between categories and between categories and the things that the supermarkets highlight for me. So there are part of me that I like to find information based on what my existing perceptions of how conventional category is. But there are also a lazy part of me that I don't want to think too much. I'll just let what I see to lead me to the next actions. So stuff like staff picks, what's new, local produce, prime discounts. So those are all these catchy phrases that you pay attention to, but sometimes I don't like them. I want something a little bit more conventional, and I search for things. So that's why I'm calling at the bottom that search and service, they are, to me, these two examples are very different. I spent a little bit of time on that slide because I thought it's a very interesting comparison. So if you're like me who's thinking about random themes when you're walking into the bookstores or supermarket, and you might have some experience like this. And some people would like a cozy space, and some people like vaulted ceiling. And my eye or attention just naturally being drawn into things like staff pick, special subjects, recommendations. And in supermarkets, I just can't leave. I can't take my eye away from this prime extra 10% discount. It's so big and then yellow. Sometimes I feel more comfortable just look around and then feel excitement of discovery. And sometimes I feel frustrated when I walk into long aisles and then trying to find information, but what I saw is really just a list of categories that I have no interest of. And I feel delighted to see attention to details like putting things in a color, putting things into a group. And I like to see discount tags that tells me how much that I can save. And to the right example, I actually don't quite like, I don't feel quite comfortable with it, but some people find this very intriguing. So you see the fitness tracker along with a health bar linking together. So when you're just looking around, your mind can be somewhat interrupted by information that the retailers tell you, say, stop thinking, do this. And I find this message is pretty interesting, and I call this message is guided intent. Guided intent. So if done in a good way, this interruptions catches your attention and make you see things that you did not even know that you realize, you don't even know that you need. And I think this has a lot to do with design. So when I approach design problems, instead of I'm calling out my design choices using these designer-friendly terms, first impression, visual contracts, call to actions, the way that I communicate design is not right. I like to use a list from the left. So I would like to elaborate more about this guided intent. Intent is not a laundry list of to-do, and because I came from search, and my job has a lot to do with this word intent. So I use intent more often than stories. So I will talk about the relationship between intent and story a little bit more. I think this is quite a good example between two financial services. That one I feel like it's a little bit more user-friendly, and another one is really just a laundry list. So I put a little face over there, the green smiley and orange one. Okay, intent implied a focus. So these are also the comparison between two financial apps that I use. I don't want to overly suggest that one is better than the other, but as a designer, you have to be very much aware of what your user is trying to do and provide the necessary actions that limit their focus so that they don't really have to think too much, so they don't really have to browse through a long list, even if it's being grouped. They don't really have to go through the list and then find the stuff that they want. Intent is not necessarily what you would like your user to do. I think this also seems pretty obvious, but I've seen mistakes happen over and over again, including myself. You thought that you are providing service to user, but your user actually feel annoyed by the service that you provide. In this case, and I'm using Lyft and Google as a quick example of how I feel about these two applications. To your left, then you have a simple message say, where are you going? And you have search box right underneath that. On Google Map, what I saw, the first experience that I saw when I opened Google Map, maybe it's because I did not know how to do the setting. You can tell me how to remove the bottom portion. I find the explore more portion interruptive and intrusive. If I'm looking for explore more around me, I go to Yelp. I don't use Google Map. So I guess maybe there is a different, maybe there's a business interest, but even with business interest, you have to be always aware of whether the service that you're providing is matching the service that users really thinking of. So we like to say a picture is worth thousands of words. Intent is the building block of your story. So I find these pictures, hopefully I don't really have to spend too much time explaining this. When you're taking a picture, and there are certain times these pictures kind of tell you several stories and several intent. The intent from the service provider and the intent from the user. So when these two intents match, it brings users delight. When they don't match, it gives out a negative perception. And this is why when you go online reading for design thinking, user-centered design books or article, they always tell you this over and over again. You have to always ask your questions. Who are these users? What are they trying to accomplish? What do they have in mind when using it? And you try to answer it verbally, and we write story based on these questions. However, in my view, even you write it verbally, it's not as strong as the pictures to your right, because it opens up your imagination. So let's come back to this, emotional, how do you say, the journey of emotions. Good user experience depending on success of users achieving their goal. Effective storytelling means going beyond and getting user emotionally invested. Keep them engaged after their experience. So what we want is that we want our guided intent to shoot for the green line. So when I talked about stories, I like to write things down in this fashion. It would be nice if I can. It would be nice. I would like to see feedback when actions. It bothers me that. I feel comfortable when results. So let me give you an example of how I formed these stories. And this is actually a pretty interesting example that it happens a lot in my world. So I'll read out two sentences. And perhaps you can find that there is a difference between the sentences in terms of storytelling. One, let me give, as a user, I want an easy-to-use keyboard on my phone that auto-corrects my typing mistake. As a user, I want an easy-to-use keyboard on my phone that auto-corrects my typing mistake. So instead of saying this, I changed this story to something like, I don't like typing when I'm on the phone. I don't like typing when I'm on the phone. So what's the difference between these two sentences? Because the first sentence is the story is guiding you to try to solve the problems of keyboard, and your focus is get to keyboard. The second problem is focused on the annoyances when typing, and when you read that out loud, your focus changes to typing. So I hope that example kind of makes sense to you, because when you're writing a story, it's very easy to be too precise that you're losing track of the real problems that you should be solving. So next, let's talk about visual techniques. Visual narrative is an art of clarity. Our brain is wired to perceive things in patterns, colors, groups, things that are similar to each other. And our brain is also capable of connecting related things and can be easily distracted when unrelated things that catches your attention. And you know when you see things that's oddly interesting. These visual tensions can be spotted almost instantaneously. So if you can, please memorize in the previous three behavioral patterns. So these behavioral patterns are actually interrelated. The differences are especially pronounced when scanning a large amount of information. So this particular graphic is often cited eye-tracking study conducted by a well-known UX specialist, a co-founder of Nielsen Norman Groups, Jacob Nielsen. And I think a lot of us have probably heard about the name. When I was back in school in the early 2000s, late 1990s, Jacob Nielsen is the UX guru when user experience was still not a term at that time. So in many eye tracking studies, this diagram describes a general patterns of how your eyes move. And some people just simply call it reading gravity. And generally speaking, the reading gravities fall into these three general patterns. And to the left, some people call it Gutenberg diagram. I find this a little bit too, that word is a little bit too heavy for me, but maybe I didn't do enough research. Perhaps you have heard this term more than I do. So you have a scan line, which is like the yellow line over there, and then you have what they call the F patterns and D pattern. So designers are really are known for being super picky about alignment. And I've heard a lot of people talking about alignments, but I didn't really see a lot of people explaining why alignment is this important. It's not only about it looks pretty or it's easy to look at. It is that alignment reinforces the visual stability and the content structures that allow you to consume larger amount of information in this F, V, and diagnostic fashion. So building an application is really not reading a book. So when we're talking about Z patterns or F patterns of our scan line, we're usually referring to what they call evenly distributed information. So evenly distribution information to me is like reading a book. Yeah, you're reading a book, so you go from left to right, top down. That's very natural. However, the visual techniques allow you to alter this reading pattern, to break out from F patterns and then Z patterns. So I find this notions pretty interesting, and I thought it's, we talked about the term visual hierarchy a lot, but we didn't really elaborate more about how visual hierarchy is related to evenly distributed, well-constructed grids, right, information. To me, they are contrasting each other. So when you're doing design, you have to know that in what circumstances you want your visual to be, your visual structure to be stable. And in some circumstances, you want to use this so-called guided intent to derail your user's attention and then focus on something else. So I will use an example from the Apple's Human Interface Guideline page, and this page has no images, it's all text. But when you look at this text, and I'm calling out 1, 2, 3, That means that there are 3 different types of fonts here, and you might notice that these 3 types of fonts is different from the 2 fonts to the left and different from the 2 fonts to the right, on top. So let me call this out loud. Typography can embrace functions. So in this case, just by altering this visual hierarchy, you are actually creating this invisible sense of groups. 1, 2, 3 is blue, and then A and B to the left is another group, and then top is another group. So without even needing any kind of grid or line, it just naturally forms these visual differences. And actually, I think it creates both the visual stabilities and then also the attention that it's been intended for. Know your options when suggesting choices. I've seen this kind of mistakes a lot, and it happens to us as well. I use a mail app every day. I don't want to call out the mail app name. When I want to make some changes, then it opens up the dialog box. It says, save, discard, cancel. So what happened is that if I did not make any change, save, discard, cancel does exactly the same thing. And I got confused about what exactly the buttons that I should be clicking. So the alternative is that, well, why don't we use OK and cancel? And if you think this path a little bit further, you have 1 button, and maybe you don't need button at all. So I'm not saying that one is better than the other, but I think consistency or being aware of the options, being aware of the mental steps that your users have to take for taking an action is very important. And these actions, often people like to say, you should probably put it in verbs rather than nouns, rather than a long sentence. The shorter, the better, so it actually has a very clear message to tell your user, do this. There is also a difference between this, I call this 2 methods. One is don't make me think, and then the other is let me think twice. So for a lot of this, we call this linear workflow, there is a tendency that we just quickly guide users through different steps and then let them to click the buttons without much thinking. But I saw this right buttons on one of my banking app when I transfer money. So yeah, when I transfer money, I want to make sure that I don't accidentally click a done button. It is still a binary yes or no decision, but it takes a longer travel distance for my fingers to reach from left to right. So I think this kind of technique is also an interesting method. Let's call it think fast and think slow. I think when you're making your design choices, be always aware of what defines things fast and things slow. So let's come back to the example applications that I'm using. So when I approach design problems, I tend to use different methods, and those methods are not necessarily linear. It's not like I want to create a high fidelity mock to begin with, or do the wireframe later, or I do wireframe first, or the other way around. What I'm doing is that I constantly go back and forth between this, the content levels and then also the high fidelity mock-up, so that I can get a sense of a general information flow. So before I form that information flow and create that hierarchy, I always like to make sure that if this general workflow or the content structure is stable enough for me to be able to form the F pattern or a Z pattern. Once I have a stable visual structure, I start to add spices to it. And this spice to me is KonMari method, if I may say. So I'm adding some spice to this well-organized, stabilized visual structure, and also group it in a way that somewhat tells a story or somewhat tells a visual hierarchical structure between buttons, call to actions, images in the middle, and the area for taking user input. All right, let's do a quick wrap-up of what I just talked about. cutting down to what matters and focus on things that spark joys. And that is the process of decluttering. Connecting the intent and then form a stories that brings value, guided intent. Using visual techniques and then create a visual narrative and then hierarchy to bring the order. So this is the 3 messages I would like to give you, and I hope that you find the explanations and then the examples that I use interesting. And last, this is the sentence that I wrote. I find it I try to put it in front of my desk so that I can always look at this and remind me that mindful design establishes a dialogue with your audience, breaking down the barrier between users and complexities. It is a communication vehicle refined by trial and error. So the last things that I would like to introduce is the 3 books that I liked, and then I actually cited and then quoted a few sentences in my slides. My favorite book is the left. It says Predictably Irrational. This is one of my favorite books in terms of, it talks about the psychology of decision making and why we're making the choice the way that we make, not necessarily the way that we thought other people would make. So with that being said, I hope you find the first half of the presentation interesting, and I'm planning to give the stage back to my talented team member, Esther Kim. I hope you find this enjoyable. Thank you. Mm-hmm.
Thank you, Chi. Hello, I am Esther, and this is my presentation. Let's see if it comes up. It's not coming up. Well, maybe. Okay, great. Hello, everyone. My name's Esther, and I'm a product designer at Claris. I'm really excited to talk to you about the process designers take on how we inform ourselves about the narrative, and then a real hands-on approach on how I would start the creative process of the narrative. Oops. So let me give an example of an ineffective visual narrative. Sorry, I didn't burn them. This is like the most popular, one of those worst design websites that comes up, so yeah, you don't have to feel bad for them. I just kind of piggybacked on them. But as you can see, this is a sales site, and it's harder to figure out what the narrative is. Where do you start? What are you supposed to do? And having all of that, it really tells that, yeah, this design is a little bit more ineffective in getting someone to know how to start and be more informed about where to go. And one of the things that it lacks, and it's kind of something that maybe people just innately can figure out, is the way that they use color. And maybe it seems really rudimentary to people because people feel like, hey, I can use all the crayons in the crayon box too. So an effective example, of course, is Apple's checkout process here as an example. And the reason why is you know exactly where to start. There's a big title headline, you read that first, and then it's left aligned, so you start reading all the information on the left going down until you see a big blue button and you know exactly what to do next. I guess why Apple is so successful in creating such great visual narratives is because simplicity, and in this quote, it also says simplicity is the ultimate sophistication. And another thing that Apple does really well is being sophisticated. One of the things that I think Apple does really well is using color, and in the most sophisticated way. And even in this, there's only black and white and red. But knowing that, I think color theory is a very important thing that designers or anybody who is creating something should know. It's actually one of the main things that pops up in human interface guidelines, and it seems really simple, but knowing how to use colors can really impact a lot of your designs. What it can do is draw your eye to an image, evoke mood and emotion, and it can communicate importance without using any words. So if you understand this color theory, you could really feel confident in choosing colors. And even, of course, warm colors, they stand out more and they pop and they come up front, and cool colors, they recede. And they all have this different type of messaging, even culturally. So, but just to understand the basic, and we'll go through this really quickly because it's very, I know, rudimentary, but it really does help me as a designer too, understanding what colors I should be choosing for any project. So I will go through primary, which is basic colors, 3 colors that you use to make the rest of the colors. It's red, blue, and yellow, and they're the foundations. You get secondary colors by just mixing the 2 primary colors, and that's how you get orange, purple, and green. And then you get a more in-between colors, the tertiary colors, and you get more sophisticated colors of red, orange, and yellow, green, blue, purple, and red, purple. Now, I'm gonna take one of the colors, and it's a hue, and hue just means color, and I'm gonna show you guys how I use this color wheel, the Apple Inspector color wheel, so to get a more sophisticated color for whatever design. I'm gonna go through tint. And as you see the color on the target on the color wheel, it was at first on the outer, but now that I bring it in, that's how I create tint. And all tint is adding white. And then if you want to get shade, which is just adding black, all I do is add the shader, the black shader, and that creates the shade. And of course, to get opacity, all I do is change the percentage of the opacity to get that. And why opacity is really important in designing is it creates these layers and these effects that you can get that's very important in human interface guidelines. Apple talks about iOS having deference, which is a fluid motion, and it talks about OS having depth. So if you understand opacity and knowing how to blur images and create that transparency, you could get a really sophisticated type of tone and vibe for your designs. And of course, going through that, we have the rest of the color harmony. And I'm gonna go through this really quickly too, because I'll go into the more hands-on approach. But just to go through this really quickly, color harmony is basically colors that work well together. So if you know this, you can pick any colors and you have confidence that, hey, these colors work well. The first and easiest way to create color harmony is monochromatic. It's just one color, and you can create different shades just by one color. With the shade and tint and opacity effect that you have, that's how these 2 designs are using one color to create a different variety of colors. And as you can see, it's just one color, but it can do a difference. This color for this event design session site has darker purple red, and what it creates is warmth, depth, elegance, and energy. This one is using a red, but putting the white tint into it as more of its key color. It creates this whole more activist shouting tone, and it's just the same kind of red. Analogous colors are colors that are next to each other on the color wheel. And what's really interesting about analogous colors are they're actually colors from nature. So if you look at this first example, they are just color picking things from nature itself. That's probably why when you look at photography of scenic photography, it gives you this serene sense of feeling. And all it is just colors that are next to each other. In this Adidas example, they used yellow, green, and those analogous colors. But what they did was have this kind of gradient effect. And yellow is a very vibrant, vivid color, and it's kind of hard for people to see it and appreciate the yellow on designs. But as you can see, if you just do it in some more mature and sophisticated way of this gradient use, it has a different tone of it being energy filling, and it kind of fills your mood up to like, I want to go do some running, So I think that's a really successful example of how they use that, but use it in a sophisticated way. Complementary colors are just colors that are opposites of each other. So red and green, or purple and yellow. But even in this examples, you can get a different feeling. They use red and green, and this is for a site that's for editors' playlists. And they wanted to show a sense of boldness in it. And you want to do that if you really intend to mean that. And I think that's what they try to do in this. In this one, this is an architecture site, and it's red and green, the same red and green, but they used more of a tint color with adding white. And now it adds more of a inviting tone, and it's kind of softer, and it's telling people, hey, come see your architecture work. Split complementary are the side-by-side colors next to the complementary colors, and it's 3 colors. And what's interesting about them is they can create less of a jarring effect than your usual complementary colors. And it gives you more colors to work with. And so you can see you can get something very vibrant, lively, and artistic, like a dance-like motion, or like this record label company, or you could get something more mysterious by just bringing down some of the shades or tones and then adding it to be a little bit more muted like this. And it's digital agency, and it's kind of, even though it's muted, it gives you a sense of confidence, like, oh, they know what to do, let's check into it. Triadic are colors that are evenly spaced, forming a perfect triangle on the color wheel. And these are the same red, yellow, and blue, the primary colors. And you can see the different ways that these people treated it and got a different tone. You could get something like this, where this design company has a lot of specific digital illustrations, and they kind of want to make it seem luring and almost pacifying. And it tells you, hey, I know we're tiny, small illustrations, but come look at it closely. And as you can see, the more you use colors, the more that you should be focused on using a key color as your main narrative. So in this one, 75% of the design is this light blue. As you can see, that is the main focus. That's probably what you're going to go see first. And this one, the same red and yellow, but look how muted they did with the yellow, and the blue is just the blue, but the darkness of the red just gives it a more mature, realistic, commercial tone. Tetradic are colors that are are just 2 complementary colors pairs, and they form like a rectangle. And you can do a lot of things with tetradic colors too. You can get something where it's all muted into this terracotta tone, and you can get this kind of vibe from this. And this is a swim tracker. And then they emphasize the darkest green as their key color. Or you could get something like this, where this is a runner's promotion. And what they did was mute all the other colors and just focused on their key color, the bright yellow, and that really led the narrative. You could see, okay, bright delivery, first thing. And then if you see any of the other little bright yellow accents, they are just driving the user to know what to do next. This is a square color harmony, and it's basically just like the tetradic, but it's actually just forms a square. When you use colors like this, it's actually better to either have them all equally saturated, or like I mentioned before, equally saturated to create more like a pattern, but not really like a narrative. It's more, just like in this example of Pharrell Williams, his collection of work, it's all pretty vibrant. And in this way, you probably would have to use black as your key color, because it's just going to be harder for people to realize which one is your main focus. So I'm going to actually use a redesign project for this DevCon presentation. I can see our developers very excited about this. But this is an example of how our database looks like now, and it was a project that I just wanted to take on to see how I would approach it and show you guys the way that I would proceed in this way. It is just like I said, a database application made in FileMaker that engineers can use to report bugs and do other tracking for the problems that they're having. So the first questions I even ask when I even look at something like this as a project to redesign, I ask, okay, and I'm sure this will be everyone's too, what do I do? What is this all about? Where do I even start? And I think that is great when you ask a lot of questions, because that's part of the whole design process. And just being able to have that, you can go through the whole beginning of understanding, getting your research, empathizing, and then actually into the creation part. I'm only going to stop on the first iteration of the creation part, but as you can see, it actually still has to go through testing and going back to creation until you get to the final product. So a lot of things to take into account, of course, when you understand the product, but in this one, I actually just looked at the main stuff of, okay, what is the history of this big database? What is the tone, the goals, the problems? And then you kind of figure out, okay, what is the user? Who and what is their problem? And then purpose, what are the core outcomes that I want from this? And so I basically got to create one sentence that will really give me a direction as I deep dive into this, which was, okay, redesign the bug DB so that the team can identify and respond to bugs reported by users. Now, as I start researching, all it is really meeting the users and getting all of their input, because that is the key goal to everything. So I just started asking PD, product development, what is it that you look for? And they were saying, oh, status is what I look for. A designer told me, history is really valuable to me. QA said, I really care about the severity of the bug. And someone from dev said, I really need to identify people. And someone who was completely new to this said, well, where do I even start? And those are great questions. And as I start figuring out these questions and labeling them, I start to empathize with the people and figuring out, okay, what is your day-to-day like? What is your step-by-step process? And through that, it actually helps me ideate and figure out, okay, wait, can I actually change the flow so that it's just in this one seamless way? And that actually gives me the enthusiasm to even start the creation process, which is, okay, let's identify everything on this bug DB. I'm going to figure out everything and try to organize it. So I start categorizing things. I start identifying, okay, I know that these are the actions that I want to start changing and doing things to. So in this kind of rough example, and even just high idea of, okay, these are the major pain points, or these are the people areas, and just being able to do that. And then you can actually start getting more into the art direction and the visual part, which is, okay, now that I know all the problems, now that I've categorized everything, how do I want it to look? What are the directions that I want? Do I want it to be, playful versus serious? Economic versus luxurious? And I really got to figure out, okay, no, this is what I want, which is I want it to be more simple than elaborate. I want it to be quieter than loud. I want it to be maybe a little bit even more different, innovative than just your traditional other database, bug trackers. So knowing that you should always have a foundation, and what a great foundation are style guides. And those are basically guidelines and set standards with reusable elements so that your designs can look and work cohesively in an effective way. This I made in FileMaker based on Apple's kind of standards and guidelines, their look and feel. And this is a style guide. I will be giving it out to everyone. So yeah, so yay! So using this style guide, I'm going to show you how I even redesigned the bug database. This, I also want to mention this, reskinning. A lot of people think redesigning is reskinning, and reskinning is different. Reskinning is when you put all the same information, you don't change and redesign any of the elements, and you're just styling all of your things already on your design. And so that's reskinning. But this is a redesign, where I did things to move and recreate elements. And so I will go through this really quickly. And this is, just like I said, only the first part. I haven't actually gone to the testing and going into the final, but just my first approach on how I even got to here. So first off, I wanted to be very clear scan lines. Like Chi said, I wanted to have a way that people can know what to do, and I just did it left aligned and had the scan lines go down from top to bottom and left to right. And so I organized the data, and I made sure that, okay, there was a lot of places that there are details about the bugs here and there, everywhere. So I said, okay, let's just centralize all the details in one area. And so now all the bug details are in one left column. And then I also created hierarchy with the font size. They told me the bug name and the number is the most important to them. So I made sure that the bug name was the biggest thing. And then in terms of what was secondary in the hierarchy, they told me, okay, the subject is really easy for me to know what to do next. So if the subject could be second and kind of in line in the hierarchy. So I made the subject basically also bigger in size, but less bigger than the bug name. And then focusing their attention, they had all these places where they're communicating and, and conversing with people on the bug database. So I just told them, let's just centralize this one area so they could get all their history and comments in one predictable place. And then one of the bigger things that Apple does, and they do really well, is getting personal with people and communicating with them. And so I wanted them to have a place where they could find that ownership in the bug database too. So I wanted them to know that, hey, this bug is assigned to me, and knowing clearly where their action is and who's doing the action. So I also made just one clear call to action, just one place that they won't be confused knowing what to do, but just having it just centrally there. And it's kind of tied to their ownership too. And then the last part, they told me that, okay, the summary of the severity was very important, but I also thought it wasn't as important as everything, but it was also a great visual exploration for me to create something that could convey to people, maybe in less than a second, if I could just look at this bug database, can I quickly understand something? And knowing that, I wanted to summarize the bug severity in this visual way. And I tried going through gauges where people were recommending, hey, let's do gauge and percentages. But what was really important in knowing my users, they had this way of identifying bugs by letters, A, B, C, and D. And if they could read that off really quickly, I thought that would be a success. So as you can see, we still have a long way to go to see if this design would make sense. And I think it just shows that better design narratives are a really process-driven craft that starts with identifying primary purposes of the application and then creating engaging user experiences to develop meaningful products that answers all their needs. So just in closing, visual narratives depend on many factors, such as structure, color, spacing, symmetry, and all of that, font size, text, and way more. And here are just some resources that I thought were helpful for me, and these will also be available in the community. So I just want to thank you so much for your time. And yes, thank you.
So thank you very much again. Just want to let everyone know that all the presentation files will be available for download, including the sample file, the PDF of the slide. Can you hear?
Maybe
One,
I'll
two,
just...
three. Can you hear me? Okay, good. So just want to make sure that everyone knows that please give it a little bit of time, and we will reorganize the slides and then put it in a PDF that you can download. We will have some updates, and then also we'll be giving out some of the files that's been showing during the presentation. And I hope you enjoy. Thank you very much for coming, and I hope to see you next year.